Cold War.
Cold War, it's so chilly. Chilly. Your marker.
Lord have mercy on us.
Your resin marker. Are we rolling?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. All right then.
Yeah, okay, sanibona.
Hello, Mr. Nodo.
Ehamba kahle.
How are you?
Hayi sikhona mfethu singezwa kuwena.
Yebo. Kunjani wena. Okay, what are we talking about? The Cold War.
The Cold War, the war that was fought in winter.
The Ice Age.
You know how often we get those answers in class? What is the Cold War? Grade 9s or grade 12s?
And 12s, yeah. That's the most embarrassing one. They do. The Cold War was fought in the winter months. Yeah. So why is it called the Cold War then?
Ideological. It's an ideological war. There wasn't any, at least between the two powers involved, America and Russia. There wasn't any direct confrontation between the two, though there were plenty of proxy wars.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea is there wasn't any direct confrontation between America and the USSR. It was, for the most part, an ideological war. The clash between capitalism and communism, the race for world dominance, which power should emerge as the most influential power economically, politically, perhaps even socially.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the term cold is misleading. But I always equate it to kind of the idea of a fight.
Yes.
If a fight gets heated or if things get heated between two people or whatever, that would be a hot war.
Yeah.
And if it's not heated,
yeah,
it doesn't involve violence.
Because what could have been the prospects of this period of political tension between the US and the USSR? We could have had a nuclear war.
Yeah.
We could have had,
I always hesitate to, I mean, yes, that's what it becomes. But prior to that, I mean, the USSR didn't get nuclear power until 1949. So in the Cold War, according to the way we teach it anyway, after Potsdam meeting, is 1945. So you've got 4 years with one superpower, one nuclear power, and one who's not.
Yeah. Fair. Yeah.
So yeah, it's not necessarily originally that standoff of nuclear power, but I think also you could work into that the fact that there's no desire for a third world war. I mean, so when we look at the early Berlin crisis, the first Berlin crisis, we look at the idea that Berlin airlift could have led to a third world war, but Stalin didn't attempt anything. Is that because of a I suppose you could argue that because the Americans had nuclear weapons and they didn't, so maybe that's why. But I think it's more than that. I think it's the idea that nobody wanted another war so soon.
Yeah, and I like the idea of nuclear weapons being a deterrent. And I think at most, that's what they'll always be. I mean, obviously there is Hiroshima and Nagasaki where they were used for the very first time, but I think we also came to realize as humanity that there really aren't any victors in a nuclear war, even if it is one-sided, even if by 45 onwards it was just America up to a certain point with nuclear weapons. But what are you really destroying? You are potentially wounding global economics, and that is going to backfire on you as well. So I think that also plays a part in this desire not to have a third world war.
Yeah, I think morally, even the most dominant superpower in a very imbalanced situation, while those political leaders may not, many in that society will look at it ethically. I mean, take Robert Oppenheimer himself. Once he saw that first test, and he says quite solemnly, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Yep.
And so I mean, I think that society. I mean, you can look at Britain in colonial years, colonization, and when they start to retract various laws of segregation and discrimination, do they do that out of... Do the leaders do it out of, political efficacy, or do the people of their society start to demand that?
It's a bit of a tricky one, though,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, so I think the Cold War's similar in that sense.
It's understanding consequence, I think. I think to a greater degree, it's understanding what does this mean for the future of humanity, for the future of the nation, if we go down this route. I'm gonna put my finger on consequence. I think it's that realization that no one is going to emerge out of this and lead a prosperous life and economy.
I'd like to go along with that. I like to think that humanity always stops itself at the brink of destruction. The mad theory, mutually assured destruction, which is obviously post-49, has held out. We are still all alive. I think that we've had a lot of close calls, Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably the Second Berlin Crisis. Things that have happened, we hear stories of things that happened in the 70s, where there was a test, I think, from the Russians. I forget the year, I think it was like 72 or something. And the communication between the two wasn't great, and it was like a very last minute thing where America would have responded to this test, or maybe it was a false alarm or something, but either way, the Americans had their fingers on the red button, didn't quite push it. So we have apparently, doubt we know much about it, but we've apparently been moments away from complete destruction. But I suppose in terms of what they need to know, obviously Potsdam is the beginnings. The focus of that looks at the division of Germany and the division of Berlin, which is obviously critical because it makes Berlin in particular the focal point, and obviously historically twice, the First and Second Berlin Crisis. Let's look at the division of Germany and Berlin first.
Cool.
Essentially looking at, let's look at the West first. Capitalist, democratic, desire to, I suppose, to re-educate Germany, to get rid of this Nazi propaganda that was in there. Their ultimate goal was reunification. Russia's, by this stage under Stalin, their goal was to never allow Germany to reunite, and ultimately, as the years went by into the 50s, to create a massive buffer between themselves and the West.
Europe,
and obviously Germany having done this twice, whether you blame Germany exclusively or not for World War I, that's besides the point. Stalin certainly would have, and World War II, I don't think there's much question about who's to blame.
And I think that's an important point while we're there, just also reflecting on the lessons the West had learned from the Treaty of Versailles in particular, hence their stance, their position on how Germany should be approached, post World War II.
Yeah, I think it's a good point.
Versus Stalin, on the other hand, who sees the West and Western culture, democracy, capitalism as a threat, and therefore perceiving what the West intended to achieve in Germany as a potential threat for Russia as well. Hence these satellite states, the buffer zone.
So I mean, the eastern zone, I think it's significant to point out that West Germany, or the Allied zones at first until 49, are obviously under capitalist influence. They are democratic and they start to thrive. And this, I suppose, let's first say East Germany, or the Russian zone, the Soviet zone, is essentially placed under, it's under Soviet control, but it's placed under a communist system, and it starts to suffer the same Stalinism type ideologies that USSR had suffered during the 30s and 40s. And that essentially means, collectivization, 5-year plans, etc., and it becomes poor. Key point is then Berlin. And so obviously what do? They do exactly the same. They split Berlin into 4 zones, west and east, essentially. Britain, France, and America on the west, and Soviet Union on the east, and obviously that leads to a similar situation, and the key point that I think is the hardest concept of this whole topic is that to get them to understand that you have capitalism and communism, the primary ideological differences, right next door to each other.
Yeah. Hey.
Okay, and so you can literally live in the East under this somewhat impoverished system of communism, not progressing. Also, important to point out that Russia treats East Germany, the Soviet zone, as essentially a place of reparations. They reap all the produce, take it back to the Soviet Union. They take all the profits, everything and anything that still exists, to essentially pay themselves reparations.
And this is in addition to the fact that communism as a policy, especially if you are rebuilding an economy, it has its flaws. And I mean, we could say the same for capitalism, but in terms of which is most likely to succeed in rebuilding, communism certainly, or historically.
I think there's no argument that historically communism has failed every time. I mean, I think that communism has never existed as an ideology. It means that there's no government, there's no monetary economy, there's trade, there's barter, there's a classless society run by the people, the dictatorship of the proletariat, according to Marx. And that happened maybe arguably for about 3 months in 1917 prior to the Russian Civil War. So historically it's been socialism, the difference being simply that is a government-run state, and government controls all production, all means of production, industry and mining and so on.
Yeah, but that very same production, I mean, there's labor involved, there's the financial sector involved, there's export, import. That's all capitalism fundamentally.
Well, from one perspective, from a state perspective.
So what are you distributing? What are you regulating? You are regulating what has been built by individuals, by corporations. There's an exchange of services, goods, etc., etc. There's labor involved. Yeah, so I actually can't think of examples where communism has actually built something from scratch. Where there aren't producers out there, who are communist. And
look, I'm sure there are examples. I mean, communist Russia became an incredibly developed nation, but also under a dictatorship and slave labor and so on and so forth. So is that communism then? So I think the point is that communism has never functioned in its theory, and it's always reverted to socialism, a dictatorship, an autocratic society with, terror in most cases. If you were to look at any of Mao Zedong's communist China and Fidel Castro's communist Cuba and obviously Russia and all the Eastern European Soviet satellite states, essentially were under dictatorships and took away human rights. There was censorship, there was, oppression and such. East Germany from that point post World War II was run essentially under terror by the Stasi. The Stasi are, a Nazi-esque secret police, Gestapo-like secret police. So, and then I think that brings us back to Berlin as a separated, four-zoned emulation of Germany post 45, where you can quite literally live in the East and suffer the oppression of the Stasi, have an indoctrination system of oppression, and then you can work in the West and enjoy the good life of the West, with where you've got, because it's in the midst of the Eastern communist zone, and again, this is that point that they struggle to perceive, I always try to explain it. I mean, we show it on maps and that, but if you look at Berlin, it's sort of towards the east of the east. So it's pretty much in the east, entirely in the east. It's in its own split. You have half of Berlin, which is like a little oasis of capitalist democracy. And obviously that can't survive on its own. Now, this is where the kind of the crisis part comes in, because it's an island, an oasis of capitalism and democracy in the midst of the Soviet Union communist zone and right next door to the east of Berlin. It has to be fed via rail, road, canals, by the West. So the West German, the American, the British zone in particular, French probably to a lesser degree, are shipping the stuff in via the roads and the rails and the canals into West Berlin, so they can live that same thriving, growing, progressive life of the capitalist West. I don't want to jump straight into the first Berlin crisis, because there are other things to discuss prior to that chronologically, but just to understand that circumstance, the frustration, the anger, the resentment of communist Russia, of Stalin, obviously, watching as the East is clearly not progressing under this system, and the West is very deliberately being stimulated and grown. In fact, it was the West's mission to make sure that West Berlin was, contradictorily much better, because it's a contest. I mean, that's again to define a Cold War. I mean, we said it's the competition between the ideologies, but it's a contest. It's a political propaganda competition, and so I kind of look at each of these little rounds as a one round in a boxing match kind of thing, where each side is trying to win. So
man, and for some of the questions they could possibly get in assessments, for example, you do get depictions of that. The prosperity of the West versus the poverty of the East, and this necessitates, and I'm sure we'll get into it, the Berlin Wall as well. How do you regulate this mass exodus of people from the east of Berlin into the West, to secure that quality life. And I think that's a very important point when dealing with this ideological battle, because for Stalin this is a clear depiction of the failures of communism, and for the West this is a clear embodiment of the successes of capitalism.
So I would okay, so once, I mean, they could get the split of Germany, the split of Berlin as a question. Doesn't often come up. But very importantly, straight after that, 1946, Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill, gives this famous Iron Curtain speech where he essentially, and again, they have to note this as propaganda, because the Cold War, a lot of the question is, or often the question is, how did tensions increase during the Cold War? It might specifically ask about that speech. It might ask about the first or second Berlin crisis, but it'll focus potentially on, how tensions increased, maybe who was to blame, that sort of thing. Every speech, starting with the Iron Curtain speech, is in fact a propaganda point. It's a tension increaser, because what is propaganda? When you give a speech, you're appealing to a group of people, you're trying to elevate your side and demonize the other side, vilify. Why is our production manager popping around and our production assistant
popping around
or anywho? So the Iron Curtain speech, Churchill gives in America at the university in Missouri. He gives this speech. He talks about how Europe is falling into this divide. There is an Iron Curtain falling between blah blah blah, from the Asiatic to the Baltic, and he's talking about how these famous ancient cities of Prague and whichever other ones, Budapest, and that are being they're disappearing into the east. They are being veiled by this Iron Curtain. Why an Iron Curtain? It's obviously a metaphor. There's no actual curtain, and it's certainly not iron. The point of that is often also quite difficult to
Yeah.
grasp. A curtain would veil something, but it's easily moved aside. An iron curtain would not be movable.
Yeah.
It's immovable.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and so what is he trying to say? He's obviously demonizing Stalin. Stalin is now being conveyed or portrayed as a villain. Whether he is or isn't is irrelevant. It's you could look at that from many perspectives. My own personal opinion, he's very much a villain. He's responsible for anywhere between 20 and 40, 50 million of his own people's deaths through his various policies and actual direct purges in the 30s. Anyway, so Churchill in his own speech creates a very famous image, basically, of the divide between East and West Europe. How East Europe has now become controlled. It is progressively becoming more and more controlled by the East, by Stalin.
We wouldn't regard that as propaganda as well from the West, wouldn't we now?
Well, it's 100% propaganda. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So the Iron Curtain speech is very much a propaganda speech in order to vilify the East.
Yeah.
And obviously that's back and forth. So what the kids need to understand is that these cartoons, these speeches, all of these things are propaganda. The Iron Curtain itself as an image is a propaganda ploy. Again, whether it's true or not is not that relevant. It is
it's how it's being used.
Yeah, exactly. It's there to indoctrinate the Western listeners, the audience. If you were to look at the people in the East, the people under the Russian influence, they're getting the same from their own side. And just jump forward a bit, what did Khrushchev call the Berlin Wall? He calls it the anti-fascist bulwark, meaning it's an anti-West fascist. Now the West are being called fascists, buffer to keep them out, from harming. He's protecting the people of the East. Which I think if we analyze that historically is somewhat wrong, but
I mean, they are trying to escape the East
exactly
to the West, so it's actually keeping them in.
Exactly. Yeah. So that Iron Curtain speech is kind of a very significant point. It's something that can come up. It's definitely propaganda, but it's also, it's defining this this descent, certainly of the East, into a veiled Stalin-controlled Soviet Union-influenced sphere. So the Soviet sphere of influence basically is now beyond that Iron Curtain, and there's no way for the West to see what's going on because it's an Iron Curtain. So he's obviously referring to the militancy, the fact that Stalin won't have any won't allow any access from the West or anything like that. Whereas the West does welcome people from the East. In fact, it tries to lure them with its wealth. It's a contest. They want to be better.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the next significant speech would be the Truman Doctrine.
Hey. So this idea of the spreading of communism, that various other states that are, so this is at a global scale now, that nations that are most prone to poverty, economic collapse, are most likely to adopt communism as a concept, as a political, economic policy.
And why is that?
I mean, well, let's look at what communism does. What's the premise of communism? We are saying let there be an equal distribution of wealth. Let the nation's wealth benefit everyone. And so who do we naturally target here? We target producers. We target the so-called owners of the means of production. This kind of goes back to my point earlier, that communism is an output policy. You place it right at the end of wealth and production, and someone has worked, someone has produced, and you're basically saying, how do we then share this? Yeah. And so in effect, it doesn't sustain any economy. It always leads to that particular economy collapsing. But also this is a view that would have been pioneered by the West, to say that they are after wealth, they are after this, they are after that. We can't let them have it. They can't gather as many territories around the world as they could. mind you, this is post-World War II. So there's bound to be a lot of countries around the world which were struggling economically and would have seen communism an appealing policy.
Yeah.
And we're most likely going to adopt it. And this is the Cold War. We the US and the USSR in competition for world dominance, for emerging as the most prominent superpower.
Yeah, often referred to as spheres of influence by the examiners.
Yes, and so the Truman Doctrine essentially says if you can cure poverty around the world, then communism becomes less appealing. Right?
Exactly.
The only way to curb the spread of communism is to eliminate social injustices. So let there be democracy, let people have a voice, let there be economic growth, let people be able to sustain their own livelihoods, and then they are most prone to frown upon communism and turn to democracy, capitalism, etc. And so that's the idea here, hence we call it the Truman Doctrine. That's the teaching.
Yeah, doctrine being a teaching. An interesting one there, just on a slight tangent, and the term indoctrinate, and essentially comes from the church, because the church was responsible for education way back when. So a doctrine of the church, to indoctrinate, means to teach, but it obviously at times, it becomes somewhat biased in propaganda and so on. So President Truman's doctrine, his speech to his own Congress, a very definitive speech. We've got way too much to
What's this?
to this.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean his speech to his own Congress is exactly that. It's an appeal to Congress to provide monetary aid, economic aid to those poorer Western European countries, and obviously Greece and Turkey are the first two recipients of that, about $400 million. And in it, you can hear that speech quite easily. It's a very propagandistic, if that's a word, definition of good and evil, basically, along the same lines of the Iron Curtain speech, where he basically defines two systems in the world. One is free and fair, democratic. Essentially, he's referring to the West and democracy and capitalism and so on, and there's no oppression. And then he refers to Stalin, essentially Stalin's Eastern communist, autocratic, oppressive, etc., etc. He puts in all the words there, and he says in order to to prevent that, hence the Truman Doctrine, stop the spread of communism, to prevent that from spreading, from reaching further regions of Europe and so on, we need to provide financial economic aid to those poorer countries, Greece and Turkey. And so, that becomes a policy that lasts until 1973, when eventually America withdraws from Vietnam, tail between its legs, which will be another discussion for a different episode. And I think that's kind of the from that economic aid that he mentions becomes known as the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall, the Secretary of State at the time, who I assume proposed it. So Marshall Plan, this is another thing that can be the focus. I think this is what we examine them on in term one. Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan work hand in hand. The Truman Doctrine is the idea of stopping the spread of communism, containment policy, contain communism where it is, don't allow it to spread. The Marshall Plan is the tool
the execution.
Which, how do you achieve that? You provide those poor countries, Western European countries, with financial economic aid, and so that will lead to a better economy in that state, and then they won't want communism as you described. So
but all that lands up happening is now you have, because also let's remember, in every society there will always be various classes. You're always going to have the wealthy elite, you're going to have the middle class, you're going to have the bottom class, right? And so in these various nations you had a certain group of people who found democracy, capitalism, individualism appealing. And it typically would have been middle upper classes. You know, the lower classes, as the feudal model would have called them, the peasants, or 30 states in France. They would have found communism a more appealing ideology. And so when you look at South Africa, for instance, you know, how did the Cold War affect South Africa? You would find that there were certain groups in our society that would have leaned more towards democracy, capitalism, whilst those were marginalized by the apartheid system in particular would have aligned themselves with Russia and so forth. And so same can be said for Vietnam. The same could be said for various other countries, Cuba, perhaps to an extent. And so and this sort of brings us to the discussion on which we'll perhaps have on another episode when we look at how the Cold War would have affected various nations. How did the Cold War play a role in Vietnam? How did it affect South Africa? How did it?
We've touched on that. I mean, that idea of die rooi gevaar when we spoke about the 80s, and so that was obviously the main threat, the main concern. Production manager, what are we at?
Time.
Yes, because you're telling us to wrap. Huh?
34.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should we do an episode 2 because we've barely got to the surface of this discussion?
I think so. Yeah.
So we'll pick up.
Let's have a part 2.
We'll pick up. That's the basics. That's the fundamentals. We'll pick up at the first Berlin crisis, and then move our way through to the second. Right.
Alrighty.
Shall we wrap it?